This from the Free Thought Project. State now assumes all homeschoolers are child abusers. Reveals plan for involuntary home visits. Lawmakers in the state of California are now pushing for families who homeschool their children to be subject to involuntary home visits from state employees, treating those parents with the same oversight and involvement that they would give parents who have abused their children. The new regulations could consist of forced meetings with Child Protective Services and other government agencies, which would leave the burden on the parents to prove to the government that they are fit to be parents who homeschool their children, according to state guidelines. As the Washington Examiner reported, if this increase in government oversight becomes law, it would reduce the valid legal option of homeschooling from a fundamental parental right to direct the education and school choice for children to compelled consent to government intrusion upon the sanctity and privacy of the home and school choice.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
I've also asked the school board to make a part of every day some kind of anti-violence, anti-gun message. Every day, every school, at every level. One thing that I think is clear with young people and with adults as well is that we just have to be repetitive about this. It's not enough to simply have a catchy ad on a Monday and then only do it every Monday. We need to do this every day of the week and just really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way.
If it's not a him and if it's not a her, what is it? Dr. Jordan Peterson is a professor at the University of Toronto, joins me now because there's been this debate that's been simmering around there, and you're at the center of it, about politically correctness. And some people are saying, well, we don't need to be referred to by that certain pronoun, him or her. But what's the solution?
Well, the solution at the moment is mandated use of whatever pronoun someone demands to be referred to by. Now, I think when the...
Can they suggest anything?
As far as I can tell, they can. And I'm not trying to be alarmist about this, but what's happened since the legislation was introduced is that there's been an explosion in gender identity categories. And so, for example, in New York now, there are 31 protected gender identity categories. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing in the legislation that stops there from being a requirement for people to use a different pronoun for every single one of those categories.
So as a professor, and you get a class at the start of the year, does someone have to have a sign on them to say which one they are, what they prefer? The
practicalities of this are obviously one of the impediments to, one of the reasons for the legislation being improperly formulated, in my opinion. I mean, I believe that when people were first considering drafting this, they thought maybe there would be 2.1 genders, something like that, so there'd be he, she, and some alternative term which we haven't settled on.
It's sort of like years ago when it was Mrs., Miss, and people said then, well, we want Ms. But there's only one Ms.
Yes.
So there's 3 categories. What you're telling us now is that there could be 40, there could be more.
Well, there's 58 on Facebook. And
so what is the administration of the university saying to you when you say, well, this just is unworkable?
Well, they sent me 2 letters, one of which was a warning and one which was a more serious warning, stating that the fact that I was having this discussion was probably illegal under the Ontario Human Rights Code, which is exactly what I made the video about, because I thought it probably was illegal. So I do believe that under current Ontario law, perhaps even the discussion that we're having right now is illegal. And you might think that that's...
They aren't running in here to arrest us right now. Well, we're fine for now.
Yes, we're fine for now. But the university took that seriously enough to warn me. But I also should say that on Friday I went and talked to the dean because they asked me to stop talking about it. And I went and talked to the dean and I suggested that we deal with this like civilized human beings and have a debate that the university would host on the issue. And they have agreed to do that. So
they're going to have a public debate. Students and other people can attend and say, okay, what's the solution?
Well, I don't know if the public will be invited to attend, but we're going to have it broadcast on YouTube live cast on YouTube. I think it's going to be restricted to the university community, but we are going to have a debate about it.
So it's not really just you then and the university. What is happening is that the university is saying we have provincial law here now, which is dictating certain actions on our behalf.
Well, I think that they're very concerned about that. Yes, they actually thanked me today. The Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, David Cameron, actually thanked me for bringing this to the attention of the university community.
Yeah, he's not a stupid man.
No, he's not. By no means.
And so, I mean, he's sensitive to it, though, but they're saying the provincial law, when was this law changed in the province?
Well, I don't know when the...
Approximately.
It's within the last few years, but Bill C-16 is the same law at the federal level, and it just passed second reading. And so this is law in 5 provinces already and is about to become national law. And I also should point out that it makes discussion around pronoun use and around gender identity subject to the provisions of the hate speech. It's not merely, yes, it's not good.
It's not good. People who wish to increase the power of the state and erode individual liberty almost always call for the centralization of education, because by centralization, they create the perfect setting for indoctrination. We have seen increasing calls in America for the criminalization of the act of homeschooling children, something we've seen increasingly throughout the Western world. Attempting to homeschool in Germany can actually get your children taken away by the government. Centralization of education is something we've seen in Germany before, as well as in all other collectivist societies.
This is the story of one man's childhood. 10 years old when the Nazis came to power, like so many children in Germany, Henry Mettelman learned to live, to fight, if necessary to die, for Adolf Hitler.
When my opponents say, we won't join you, I just say, your children are mine already. What are you? In time you'll die. But your sons and daughters stand forever in my new camp, and in a short time they'll know nothing else but this new community.
For Henry's parents, the Nazi takeover spelled disaster. Henry remembers their hopelessness as the brown pest, as his father called them, marched in triumph outside. But for Henry, the Nazis were new, exciting.
When my father spoke so badly about them, I just didn't understand it. I thought, what does he mean that these Nazis are so dangerous? They were always so friendly to me. I used to run alongside them as they marched, singing their songs with them. They were always so smart in their uniforms, the leather, the jackboots. Es marschiert mit ruhig festem Schritt.
To get the next generation on their side, the Nazis had put tremendous energy into winning them over. Theirs was the party of youth against age, offering young people not just a dream, but a role to play.
Понимаете, я же прошел такое же испытание, как...
I grew up like any other Soviet child. I went to Soviet school, I became a pioneer, and then a young communist.
Я был пионером, был комсомольцем.
When I turned 6, they gave me an incredibly thick Pushkin volume. I was barely able to drag it with both hands. I went to a pioneer camp. They were wonderful. The Communist Internationale organized them. By any standards, we lived in poverty. Mum and Dad received very meager incomes. We lived in a communal apartment with other families. The apartment we used to live in was considered big because at the time, living in a 3 or 4 room apartment was a great luxury. I remember when we went to Red Square to see Fidel Castro when he came to Russia. I had to bring a stupid bunch of artificial flowers, which I later had to give out in the Red Square area. I remember the bonfires at the Red Square and the soldiers in their furs wearing their Budyonov berets and holding rifles. Those were the days of Lenin's death. By this time, I was 14.
Это когда смерть Ленина была. Мне было 14 лет уже. Нас же, наше поколение, воспитывали настолько атеистически.
Our whole generation had been brought up in such an atheist educational system, both at home and at school, that faith had no room at all in our lives.
Веры просто не оставалось никакого места.
When we secretly went to church for Easter, they somehow found out about it and singled us out for humiliation during school assembly. We were not allowed to go to church on any account.
Throughout human history, controlling the minds of the masses has always been the key to holding power. This is why people who rule take so much time studying thinkers like Niccolo Machiavelli. A recent study done by NASA sheds some light on just how destructive centralized education could be.
The thing that changed everything for us in trying to understand creativity is that somebody from NASA came to us, the deputy director, and said, look, we have a lot of people working for us. We need some way to select the people that are the most creative so they can go on the teams that are facing the toughest problems. Can you give us some kind of an instrument, a test or something that we can give to find those people? We didn't have such a thing, but we developed it, we applied it, and it was very predictive. It worked really well. But the idea emerged that, gee, we still don't know where creativity comes from. Is it that some people are born with it and others not? Or is it learned? Does it come from our experience in life? And the idea came up, this test is so simple. Why don't we give it to some children and see how they do? So we did. We created a sample of the American population with 1,600 children and started it out when they were about 5 years old. Now here's a question I want to ask you. This is a test for the ability to look at a problem and come up with new, different, and innovative ideas. What percentage of those 5-year-olds fell into what we might call the genius category of imagination? 80, 90, wow. This is a great audience. There are some audiences that don't guess quite that high. 98%. We were pretty shocked. Some people like you would probably not be shocked. You probably, I suspect you've been 5-year-olds, so there you are. But, the information was so astonishing, we decided to turn that into a longitudinal study, go back 5 years later and see how they were doing. So we went back, they're now 10. What would you guess? Somebody came on very close. 30%. We decided to extend it for 5 more years. They're now 15. Well, we have some pessimists out there. It was all the way up to 12. So you can see something of a trend here, right? That study ended because so many people got depressed. Most of the testing was done by teachers, and they just didn't want to do it again. But we have tested a lot of adults. And what would you guess? You're close. 2%. Now, the great historian Oswald Spengler once said, in all of his years of studying history, he had concluded it only takes 2% of a population to create the basic ideas and that everybody else applies them. And it turned out, gee, he was pretty close to right. Look, folks, if we're going to enter the future with hope, that's not going to work. We have to do something about it. And what we found with those children was the thing that I want to try to share with you and hope that you walk out of here tonight knowing why that happened and what you can do about it, because you have the possibility of being at 98% tomorrow. And I'm serious about that. What we found from the studies with children and from looking at the way brains work, we can actually do that. There are 2 kinds of thinking that occur in the brain, and they use different parts of the brain, and it's a totally different paradigm in the sense of how we form something in our minds. One is called divergent, that's imagination. That's generating new possibilities, and the other is called convergent. And that's where you're making a judgment. You're making a decision. You're testing something. You're criticizing. You're evaluating. So one is like an accelerator and the other one is like the brake. We found that what happens to these children as we educate them is we teach them to do both kinds of thinking at the same time. So when somebody asks you to come up with new ideas, as you come up with them, what we've mostly learned in school is to start looking at them immediately and trying to say, oh, well, you could hear the stuff that goes on. We've done that before, we've never done that, that's crazy, that'll cost too much, all of that. When you actually look at what's happening inside the brain, you find that neurons are fighting each other and actually diminishing the power of the brain because we're constantly judging, criticizing, etc. This is not going to work, folks. You need to find the 5-year-old, and you can. That capability never goes away. That part of the brain that produces this wonderful imagination is something that you exercise every day when you're dreaming. So the great designer said, I'm going to put that mechanism so they exercise it every day in case they ever need an idea. You've got that capability, absolutely. And you'll move from the normal brain, which is that colored area shows normal thinking, to a brain that is very active everywhere, particularly in the front. So it gets worse because if we're operating under fear, we're using even a smaller part of the brain. And as we begin to use logic, we use more, but we begin to use creative thinking and the brain lights up. It's just extraordinary what happens. And nature does this as well, we found. That evolution works that way, producing many alternatives, then through natural selection, selecting the best ones. But it's always creating a lot of possibilities before it starts selecting. So the question we face for the future is, are we going to be in a culture that depends on right answers, that are repeatable, that are always predictable? Or are we going to have a culture where whatever it is we're thinking about, a new recipe or a spaceship, are there many possibilities? Can we create a new future that solves the new problems that we have never seen before?
I would rather live in a society with endless possibility, where imagination lives and thrives inside of all of us, and our combined imaginations produce a world that we can only imagine. Do you think we're going to get that with the Common Core, with no child left behind? The problem isn't the curriculum. The problem isn't the teachers. The problem is that we've given the government centralized control over the education system. Look what centralized education does to the imaginations of young children. Look what it does to their entrepreneurial spirit, their ability to innovate, create products, and create their own life so much greater than working for a corporation. What life do you want for your child? Do you want them to go through the Common Core? To have their creativity killed? To have their round peg jammed into a square hole? Told that they're supposed to be like everybody else, to not think for themselves, to not innovate, to not create? Or would you rather homeschool them? Put the effort in. Don't give your children to the government. John Taylor Gatto was the New York City Teacher of the Year in 1988, 1990, 1991, before he abruptly resigned, took out a one-page ad in the New York Times, and explained why he had to stop indoctrinating children, taking away their creativity and imagination. And what he said is that school is actually very effective in achieving its desired results. But the results aren't children getting A+. Well, the desired results aren't children all getting A+, going to Harvard and making hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. No. The objective of the modern centralized education system is to teach children that they have their place in society. To teach children that they should be obedient to authority, whether that be the authority of a teacher or the authority of the state. To teach children that they cannot think for themselves, that they should outsource their thinking to authority. So when they see the mainstream media tell them what to think, even if there's a contradiction in what the mainstream media is saying, it doesn't matter because that media has become the authority. It teaches children not to try too hard at anything because it doesn't matter anyway. You're given an assignment, you start to do it, and the bell rings after 40 minutes and you drop that assignment and you never pick it up again. There's no meaning behind it. Homeschooling sure provides a different option. Imagine you give a child an assignment and tell them that they should see the assignment through until they create a product and sell it for profit. You think that child might be just a little bit more motivated? Maybe you ask them to pick their direction in life. Maybe they want to do an internship, work as an apprentice for a carpenter, work as an apprentice for a businessman, for a doctor. Of course, that's hard in modern society because 1/3 of the jobs available require government license. We are completely controlled. If you follow John Taylor Gatto, you would know why that is. That in the 1950s, the Reese Committee, and I do look it up, I always tell you to look these things up, led by Norman Dodd, investigated the big tax-exempt foundations, the oligarchs in control of society, the people really in control, the big bankers, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Ford, these big tax-exempt foundations, because of course they don't pay taxes, because it's philanthropy. Let me just let you in a secret. It's not philanthropy, it's tax evasion and a system of bribes and leverage and power. So the Reese Committee investigated, and what they found was that in the early 1900s, these big tax-exempt foundations got together and they formulated a plan to hijack the American education system, because they knew if they took over the American education system, they could push collectivism, they could push socialism, which really means bigger government where they buy the politicians, and a mass of people, or a public mind completely controlled through their education system. And they created the modern education system, which was adopted from Prussia, which is the same education system they used in Nazi Germany. And they control that education system through grants, and they funnel billions and billions and billions of dollars of grants each year to the causes that they promote. Think social justice, think feminism, the destruction of the family, because when the family is destroyed, and this is why we've seen this, the state becomes the new family. Destruction of the church, as we saw in the Soviet Union video. They weren't allowed to be Christian or Catholic. They weren't allowed to have religion, and the reason for this is because religion provides true community that you could rely on. But if that's taken away, people have to rely on the state, which is why you see the constant attacks on religion in the United States of America. Instead, people rely on the welfare state, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because people stop having to rely on their neighbor. And now we live in a society where people live next to each other and they don't even know one another's names. If you read The Lost Tools of Learning, you would know that people used to learn the trivium and the quadrivium of education, and specifically the trivium. And what it would do is it would focus on the process of learning itself, the how to learn rather than what to learn. Because if you look at the Common Core, if you look at No Child Left Behind, all these state systems, they're all about standardized testing, teaching to the test. I want you to learn these couple of facts, memorize them, but don't ever master the art of learning itself, how to interpret information for yourself, how to go through primary documents. And if you study the trivium of education, and I would suggest you read The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayers, what she outlines is what's been taken away from us, that people used to be taught grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar, meaning that people would be taught the importance of defining terms, because we can't have a conversation about liberal, per se, if liberal means one thing to me and has a completely definition to you. We're not having the same conversation. Because to me, liberal, which is why I consider myself a classical liberal, means living life without the interference of government or any other centralized force, living your life freely. But in modern society, and this is by design, the word liberal has been bent. So people think liberal means taking care of your fellow man, and that could be through the increase of state power. It's no accident they've changed the definition of that word in the minds of the masses. So you teach people that the importance of understanding definitions, because once you understand definitions, it's much easier to understand material. Logic. This is where writing comes in. Once you know definitions, you write essays or you practice the art of having logical thought processes, which means the idea of having a system of self-defense where you don't have contradictory thoughts. And if you have two thoughts that contradict one another, then you know something in your ideology, something in your belief system must be wrong, and you have to make corrections. So for me, I believe that a just legal system is a moral legal system. And by moral, I define that as not inflicting harm or force against any other person that has not inflicted harm or force against you. So if I then say that if I were to then say that I support the war on drugs, well, that's a contradiction, because how could the legal system I support be moral if, to me, moral is not initiating force against people that don't initiate force, but I'm advocating for a legal system that throws people in jail cells for putting a substance in their own body where they have not initiated force against anyone else. So now I know that because of my definition of a just society is a moral society, and I've properly defined the terms, I know that I can't advocate for the war on drugs. Otherwise, I have contradictions. My logic is failing. See, once you have a system of intellectual self-defense, interpreting the world, understanding the world, creating a logical and coherent worldview becomes much easier. So those are the first two branches of this trivium that Dorothy Sayers talks about. That's been taken away from us. Grammar, logic, and the third is rhetoric. The practice, something I really need to work on, but rhetoric, the ability to properly articulate your logic to other people. Because without the ability to transfer your knowledge from yourself to another person, your knowledge never becomes wisdom. And you do this by having people present publicly. Have your child present publicly, right? You have them define their terms. You have them write out essays. And you have them check their own essays for logic to make sure that there's no contradictions within their own writings. And then they present their writings. And as the teacher or as the guide, all you have to do is challenge what they say, challenge their logic, and see if they could defend their points, articulate the point they are trying to make by using logic. And now they have grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And with these skills, you can teach yourself anything in this world. The subject matter doesn't matter. It's the process of learning that matters, not the memorization of facts. And this has been taken away from us. And they don't want us to homeschool because they don't want people to recover these lost tools of learning. So you have to make a decision. Do you want your children to be cookie cutter, or do you want your child to think for themselves, to understand the process of learning, to understand the value of pursuing your own education, to pursuing your own desires, your own wants, your own goals and ambitions, to chasing profit for your own gain? Because there is no education like a self-education. So the state keeps trying to tell us that homeschooling is bad, that homeschooling is a form of child abuse. But from what I have presented to you today, are you sure that homeschooling is child abuse, or is giving your children to the state child abuse? Thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate your support. I'm very, very passionate about education. I think we need serious educational reform in the form of decentralization. If you want to support my message of individual liberty, decentralization of education, and pretty much everything else, the return to individual liberty, I really appreciate it. You could support me financially at www.patreon.com/FFRnews. I also recently started my own blog on Steemit. So on top of these videos, I'm also writing something I think is important and something I'm also very passionate about. So again, Patreon, Steemit, really appreciate your support. Thank you.